When you picture the first American presidential election in 1789, it is easy to imagine a dignified, unified national event where a grateful country simply handed the keys of power to George Washington. But reality tells a completely different story. The election of 1789 was weird, highly chaotic, and filled with deep political anxiety. There were no primary elections, no public campaigns, no national nominating conventions, and no political parties as we know them today. Most shocking of all to the modern observer, the entire election season lasted only a few weeks, and the single biggest issue on the ballot was whether the system they were using should even exist. To understand why this election was so strange, you have to look at what the United States actually was at the time. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, they did not create a single unified country. Instead, they established 13 separate independent nations bound by a loose alliance. For 13 years, there was no president, no federal court system, and only a weak continental Congress that could not even enforce its own laws. By 1787, leaders realized this setup was failing, prompting them to gather in Philadelphia to draft a completely new constitution. The framers of this constitution faced a critical question: how should the new chief executive be chosen? They explicitly rejected a parliamentary system where Congress would choose the president, fearing cross-contamination between the branches of government. Simultaneously, they rejected a direct popular vote, viewing it as both impractical and unwise. Their solution was the Electoral College, a unique body that would meet once every 4 years for the sole purpose of selecting the president. Crucially, the framers left the method of choosing these electors entirely up to individual states. This resulted in a mismatched, fractured election across the country on January 7, 1789. Out of the 13 states, only 11 participated. North Carolina and Rhode Island had outright rejected the new Constitution and were technically not even part of the United States yet. In the remaining states, the voting process was an absolute mess of differing rules. 5 state legislatures simply chose the electors themselves without consulting the public. 4 states held direct popular votes for electors, while 2 others used a hybrid system. Even among the states that allowed citizens to vote, the methods varied wildly. Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland held statewide votes where citizens had to write down a full list of names to fill their electoral slots. To make it more complicated, Maryland mandated that a specific number of those names had to come from its eastern and western shores. Virginia was the only state to break its territory into distinct electoral districts, intentionally separate from its congressional boundaries. These mechanics were not just logistical quirks, they were deeply political. The passage of the Constitution was incredibly controversial, and a massive portion of the population, known as the anti-federalists, fiercely opposed it. They felt the new federal system was a betrayal of the Revolutionary War, trading the tyranny of a British king for a new centralization of power that would favor wealthy port cities over rural farmers. In Pennsylvania, the pro-Constitution Federalist majority engineered a statewide vote to drown out rural opposition. In Virginia, the anti-Federalist majority drew localized districts specifically to boost the voting power of rural citizens who hated the new system. This intense division became so toxic that it completely paralyzed the state of New York, preventing it from participating in the first presidential election at all. The New York legislature was split down the middle. The state Senate was Federalist, while the Assembly was anti-Federalist. The 2 houses spent weeks deadlocked over how to choose their 8 electors. The Senate wanted to split them down the middle, while the Assembly wanted a joint vote that would give the anti-Federalists every single slot. They argued right past the federal deadline, and when midnight struck on January 7th, New York had failed to appoint any electors, leaving the state completely out of the historical vote. For the states that did make it to the next phase on February 4, 1789, a major structural flaw in the Constitution created absolute panic. The original system dictated that every elector would cast 2 votes for president, without specifying which vote was for the actual president and which vote was for the vice president. The person with the most votes became president, and the runner-up became vice president. Everyone knew George Washington was going to be the president. The office had practically been designed for him while he sat in the room during the Constitutional Convention. However, Federalists were terrified that anti-Federalist electors would exploit the 2-vote system to ruin the launch of the government. If anti-Federalists threw their votes to John Adams and withheld them from Washington, they could inadvertently make Adams the president, lowering public goodwill and tanking the federal project. Alternatively, they could secure a vice presidential win for an anti-Constitution candidate like George Clinton to sabotage the executive branch from the inside. To prevent this nightmare scenario, Alexander Hamilton spearheaded a massive covert letter-writing campaign. He contacted Federalist electors across various states, pleading with them to strategically throw away their second votes on random regional candidates rather than voting for John Adams. This coordination is visible in the final results. In Connecticut, 2 electors voted for Samuel Huntington instead of Adams. In Maryland, where ice and illness prevented 2 electors from even making it to the state capitol, the remaining 6 voted for a local chief justice named Harbert Harrison. These were not genuine endorsements, they were calculated throwaway votes meant to artificially depress Adams' numbers and ensure Washington secured a definitive first-place victory. Ultimately, the frantic fears of Federalist leaders proved unnecessary. The anti-Federalist schemes never materialized, and Washington comfortably won the presidency with all 69 electoral votes. But the Hamilton mathematical meddling had an unintended consequence. It left John Adams with an embarrassingly low vote count. Adams, completely unaware of the behind-the-scenes coordination, felt utterly humiliated and devastated by the results. The flawed 2-vote system would continue to plague early American politics, nearly causing a constitutional crisis in later cycles until it was permanently fixed by the 12th Amendment. By the spring of 1789, Washington and Adams finally made their way to New York City to be sworn into office. They successfully launched the American presidency, but the path to that moment was paved with institutional gridlock, mathematical manipulation, and a deep national anxiety that nearly tore the system down before it ever began.